Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you both.
Yep.
Sam, we're going to let you guys run with it. I just had to focus people on that. I think you guys have got something that people need to really hear.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Thanks for having me back again on today. It's my pleasure to speak to Major Jason Lowery and get to interview you today. We first crossed paths a number of years ago when you were working with Rob Slaughter and the Space Camp team back in Colorado Springs, where I knew you became known as an innovator then and made the switch to Space Force, and now is probably Space Force's most prolific writer on blockchain and Bitcoin on LinkedIn. So, can you tell us what you're doing now as a National Defense Fellow at MIT?
Thanks, Sam. That's funny. So at MIT, like you said, I'm a National Defense Fellow, and my job right now is essentially to study the national strategic implications of emerging technologies. And specifically, for my case, I am studying the national strategic implications of this power projection technology called Bitcoin.
Awesome. So, I think why do you think senior leaders should be caring a little bit more about Bitcoin and blockchain, and why should the military care about internet money?
Yeah, so that's kind of like the first thing that the first wall I'm trying to knock down. And I guess we should back up a lot to really fully unpack why anyone, especially senior leaders, should care about Bitcoin or this so-called internet money. So let's rewind all the way back to the invention of gunpowder. Do you know? Do you know what people called gunpowder when it was first invented?
I imagine magic.
They thought it was medicine for like hundreds of years. Doctors talked about this medicine of black powder, this fire medicine of black powder. It didn't become famous for its relationship to guns until hundreds of years later when guns were invented. And black powder or gunpowder didn't become famous for its ability to topple empires like Constantinople until like 1,000 years after people started trading this medicine. And so that's like the first point that people need to understand is that whenever a new technology is invented, the design intent of the technology is irrelevant. What people call the technology is irrelevant. That was true when black powder was invented, or other power projection technologies were invented, and that is especially true for any abstraction that we call software, that we choose to describe the complex emergent behavior of software. Like, people forget that anytime you talk about software as anything, you're actually just describing an idea. Software is only a set of instructions that tells a computer what state to be in, a state machine what state to take. And over 80 years, we eventually we kind of migrated from describing software as machine code to assembly language to general purpose language to starting to describe its complex emergent behavior as objects, like an orientation of objects, for no other reason than the fact that that's what people understand. That's like what people know. We live in a world where objects are oriented around us, so we choose to describe the complex emergent behavior of a set of instructions that tells a computer what state to take as objects. But the objects are obviously not real, right? There's obviously not a cloud. When you pass a variable to a function, it's obviously not a real string, right? Like, these are abstractions. These are ways of describing complex emergent behavior. And that is true if you call it a coin too. A coin is not a coin. A coin is an abstraction. And so I say all this because when people just automatically say that Bitcoin is a coin and it's only a coin or only internet money, they are making so many assumptions baked in, and they don't understand it from like a basic metacognitive level, that like there is no such thing as a subject or a software object in the first place. There never has been a real thing called a software object in the first place. That's just a design intent, a design strategy, and it didn't even emerge until decades after software was first invented. And so we should probably that's like the first wall I'm trying to knock down, is when you want to talk about any type of emerging technology, like I said before, recall that design intent and names don't matter, especially when you're describing software objects. And then the other thing that you should remember is that, especially when it comes to power projection technologies, guns, gunpowder, Whitehead torpedoes, airplanes in the Air Force are a very famous example of emerging new power projection technologies. It's like a precondition. It's like most common for people to discount that emerging technology as having some type of military value. So for example, General Foch, Supreme Allied Commander of World War I, Chief of Staff of the French Army, he's famous for the quote, airplanes are interesting toys, but of no military value whatsoever. I gave the example of Constantinople when Emperor Constantine was offered to build the first cannons, and he turned it down, and a year later, Orban the engineer was shooting down the walls of Constantinople with the first cannons. Whitehead offered to build torpedoes to the UK Navy, and they turned him down. And what did Whitehead do? He goes to UK's enemies, right? So it is really common for emerging technologies to be discredited as having no military value or not being not having national strategic importance. So you combine that with the fact that software objects aren't really real, and the names that people give them are just abstractions to describe complex emergent behavior as best as our brains can handle, then maybe we should start to consider the things about Bitcoin that is real and unpack that national strategic importance, because it could be something wholly new and unique that the military needs to understand, not as a monetary system, but as a power projection system, as a bunch of people volunteering to impose a physical cost on the systemic abuse and exploitation of rule sets. So I'll pause there.
Well, you started the analogy with black powder and how, what was once a medicine then turned a weapon, kind of implies that you think Bitcoin, starting as a money, is now could potentially be a weapon. What are some of the ways you see that? Like, can you play that out for us? How do you see it as a power projection technology?
So let's back up. I get in a lot of trouble using words like weapon in the Bitcoin community, so let's back up all the way to what is the function of war from a systemic perspective. Okay, because if we understand the function of war, then we can understand the function of weapon. What is the function of war? Well, when I joined, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. What is the Constitution? The Constitution is a rule set. I didn't swear an oath to defend the president. I didn't swear an oath to defend my neighbor, to defend any object, to defend land. I swore an oath to defend a rule set. So why do that? What's the purpose of defending a rule set? Why does a rule set even need to be defended in the first place? Well, the problem with the rules is that they only work insofar as people follow the rules. the problem with rules is they only function properly insofar as your neighbor is sympathetic to the rules. The problem with rules is they only work well for the people who follow them if the intermediaries don't systemically abuse them, if the intermediaries don't exploit the rules. And so this evokes a fundamental problem with rules. They are systemically insecure from the very beginning because rules are trust-based. What I'm describing is trust-based. They only work insofar as people can be trusted to follow the rules. They're also inegalitarian, inherently unfair, because rules imply a ruling class and a ruled class. So when people agree to follow a set of rules, they actually forfeit some of their freedoms, and different people have different freedoms. So they're inherently inegalitarian, and rules are inherently trust-based, which means they're inherently insecure. And so rules require power. They require power projection to patch up their inherent systemic insecurities. And when we do this, for example, when people don't follow the rules, we call it enforcement, right? Like you use enforcement to get people, to compel people to start following the rules who would otherwise not follow them, right? So what is enforce? Well, consider the word enforce, force, okay? You compel people to follow the rules by applying a force to a mass, right? When you apply force to displace a mass, that's called power. You can measure that in watts. You can place a sensor. Okay. It works the same way regardless of how you're trying to get a rule set to work. If you need to compel people to follow a set of rules, that's called enforcement. If you need to compel your neighbor, your greedy, envious, hungry neighbor, to be sympathetic to the rules that you choose to live by, you need to apply some forces to masses to get them, to make them sympathetic, right? Or if you have systemically abusive intermediaries who are exploiting a rule set and oppressing their citizens, you also need to apply force to mass to secure against that vulnerability too, in what's called revolution. But either way, the remedy is the same. The medicine is the same for every affliction of a dysfunctioning rule set, which is power. Apply power until symptoms improve, basically. And so the function of war, the fundamental function of war, the fundamental function of any act of projecting power is to defend a rule set. That's why I swore, an oath to support and defend the Constitution. I'm going to defend a rule set against systemic exploitation abuse using brute force physical power. That is my job as a person in the military. Does that make sense so far?
It does. And so using Bitcoin to influence, foreign politics, how do you see, are you advocating that the government should be a stockpiler, an early adopter of Bitcoin?
The short answer is yes, but before we get there, let me give you my rationale for why. And this will all come out in the thesis that I'm producing as a National Defense Fellow. But backing up to the function of war, the whole point of war, what does Clausewitz say is war? War's three things. War is people accessing the blind natural forces of primordial violence. What are those blind natural forces? Power. Okay, forces applied to masses, kinetic forces applied to masses. Okay, brute force physical power. War is also a game of probability, according to Clausewitz, that rewards clever spirits. So it's not just enough to have good power projection capability. You have to engage in a game of chance, essentially, a power lottery. And however that plays out defines kind of the winner or the loser of the war. And then the third thing that Clausewitz says that war is he's famous for it. He says war is merely the continuation of policy with other means. So to classify as war is basically when policymakers choose to use this power lottery to settle some dispute over policy, to settle, or to basically settle a policy dispute, right? So his argument was always nations don't go to war for the sake of displaying their capacity for violence. Nations go to war for accessing that other means to solve policy. And what's the other means? Brute force physical power competitions. Why would a nation want to engage in something as brutal, as destructive, as lethal as war to settle a policy dispute when it has the option to adjudicate the dispute through the court of law? It's really easy. The reason why you would want to do the court of power instead of the court of law is because you don't trust the court of law. You don't trust the judge. You don't trust the judgment. You don't trust all the people in that rule set, especially if you are if you believe that it's being systemically exploited or abused. And so people choose the court of power over the court of law because the court of power is fundamentally egalitarian and fundamentally not trust-based. Therefore, it is fundamentally secure. So what does that mean? Well, war is fundamentally egalitarian because everyone is vulnerable to a bullet in the face, right? Like everyone is equally subordinate to Watts. Everyone is equally subordinate to brute force physical power. History is full of examples of people of very high rank and wealth being overturned by brute force physical power. America demonstrated this beautifully. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're a king. Your rank as a king holds no authority over in the court of power, right? And that's what revolutions prove. Revolutionary wars frequently prove this, right? King is equally vulnerable to a bullet in the face or a sword through the heart as a peasant. So they're egalitarian. They're also not trust-based because they don't require trust to function. It doesn't matter if people trust in the court of power. In fact, court of power usually works better if people don't trust in war or or don't believe in it, right? And so that's why people go to war go to court to settle a dispute. And that is what, according to Clausewitz, is fundamentally the definition of war. It's an act of nations choosing a power projection strategy, to using a power lottery to settle a dispute because they don't want to use the court of law anymore. And we've established that laws are inherently insecure, systemically insecure, because they're trust-based and inegalitarian nature. You can't fix a dysfunctioning set of rules with more systemically exploitable and abusable rules. Like if a rule set, like you can't sue your king, right? Like that doesn't usually work really well, right? Because but taking the king to a court of power does work pretty well, as history has shown us. So I say all this because we need to understand the difference between rule sets like laws and power sets. The difference between a court of law and a court of power, the reason why people would choose one or the other. Rule sets are definitely more efficient. They don't use as much energy. They don't cause as much waste. They don't end in bloodshed. They don't end in destruction. But the trade-off is they're egalitarian and they're not trust-based. So they're virtually invulnerable to systemic abuse and exploitation. Rule sets are, so it's important to understand the difference. Okay, so now let's get to weapons. What is a weapon? A weapon is just a mechanism, a tool that people use to project power in the court of power, right? If let's say a nation chooses to settle a property dispute through a power projection lottery, they're going to use weapons to do it. And weapons take many different forms, but what's usually really like consistent about weapons is they impose a physical cost, right? That can be measured in watts. So I used to be like a blast and ballistics research engineer. So I used to like literally measure the watts produced by a cartridge for a bullet, or I used to measure the watts produced by an explosion. I was like basically a myth buster. It was a really awesome job. The point is, people use watts. Weapons are just things that project watts. You use watts to remedy the systemic abuse and exploitation of rule sets. That's why people like me, people like my friends, project a lot of power, a lot of watts, to defend our rule set, our constitution, against people who would be unsympathetic to our rule set. So now we've described war, the point of war, and we've described weapons and the point of weapons. Has what I've been saying made sense so far?
It is. Now in the court of power, you have limits. So you're getting to, you get to the extreme right, and now you're looking at mutually assured destruction through a lot of watts with nuclear weapons. So I think you're getting to the point where you're talking about trust, and the court of law requires trust, and how does that tie into blockchain? But also, does Bitcoin present a mutually assured future? And can you talk to some of that?
Yeah, you might have seen, I've been writing a lot about mutually assured preservation. That's what I've been calling like the strategic selling point that could be caused by Bitcoin if it were nationally adopted. So let's fast forward to, let's go to nukes. Actually, before we go there, let's make one thing clear. Everything I've just described has been kinetic, forces displacing masses. Okay, power through forces displacing masses. But kinetic power is not the only way to generate power. Like a watt is a watt, regardless of whether it's generated with a force displacing a mass or a charge passing across a resistor. So it's the same either way. Physical cost, imposing a physical cost in watts, is like metaphysically identical, regardless of whether it's done electronically or kinetically. But everything I've just described, and most everything for the past 6,000 years of humans instantiating rule sets and defending those rule sets against systemic abuse and exploitation using power, has been done kinetically. We haven't seen a world where you can defend rule sets using something other than kinetic power until, I think, now. And so let's fast forward up till like the 1930s, 1940s, when nukes were being invented. The first application of general purpose computers, you know what the first thing we used the Harvard Mach 1 for, and then the other fully electric general purpose computer that came out like 2 or 3 years after?
Couldn't tell you.
When IBM built the first general purpose computer, like the first like operationally working one, it was instantly commandeered by the DoD for like the first couple of months to work on this like special project that no one could talk about. Okay. And then when the second fully electric general purpose computer was created, it was instantly commandeered by, I think this one was commandeered by the Army. It was like built by the Army, it was like funded by the Army, but then the same people from the same mysterious project took it over. It's like in early 1940s. Can you guess what that project was? It was the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we instantly started using the first general purpose computers to help design the detonator for atomic bombs and then the hydrogen bombs. So it's kind of cool to know that the relationship between general purpose computers and what became mutually assured destruction for the purposes of my thesis, which will make the argument for mutually assured preservation. But what needs to be said and understood is that computers themselves, these state machines that compute a state, those are actually ancient technology. We've had computers for 2,000 years. So there's nothing new about computers. There's nothing new about using machines to calculate states. We've had them since at least the astrolabes by the Greeks. What was new and fancy was that we stopped instructing those computers kinetically. We stopped using forces displacing masses and started using charges passing across resistors. We converted the way that we instruct a computer how to operate from a kinetic phenomenon to an electric phenomenon. So for example, for like 2 millennia, the only way you could instruct a computer how to operate was by pulling a lever, applying a force to displace a mass, right? Kinetic action. Turning a dial, pressing a button. Even when Harvard Mach 1 was created, the Manhattan Project scientists had to program the computer by kinetically replugging wires. There was like huge rooms of plug boards, and they would spend days replugging and kinetically plugging these wires in order to program the computer how to operate. It wasn't until a Manhattan Project scientist started thinking, well, what if we converted these instructions, these kinetic instructions, into electric signals? We convert them, we digitize them, and then into a state that can be stored on the computer and then automatically performed by the computer. And it's fascinating to read how he describes this and how other Manhattan Project scientists describe this. They were frustrated with how long it took to program a computer kinetically. It took days to do it. And so this became, this idea of converting what was inherently a kinetic action into an electric action was revolutionary for a lot of reasons. But the main reason is it caused people to shift how they think about the act of programming a computer, what state to be in. It metacognitively split the way that people perceived computer programming into two distinctly different ideas. The elements of computer programming that remained kinetic, pulling levers, pressing buttons, turning dials, flipping switches, these kinetic actions, or these manufactured elements of computer programming, or wares of computer programming that remained kinetic, that continued to have mass, were called hardware. And then the parts of computer programming that had its mass removed and was converted to an electric signal passing across a resistor, right? These manufactured items of computer programming, these wares of computer programming, were called software. It took a decade after we started thinking about this for the name to actually emerge, but software just means the elements of computer programming that don't have mass, i.e., the elements of computer programming that are non-kinetic. We just had a huge metacognitive shift. For 2,000 years, the only way to program a computer how to operate was kinetically. And then people shifted this into something called software, massless computer programming. And then fast forward 80 years and we get to the point where we take everything about software for granted, right? We live on the shoulders of giants. Okay, so why do I say all that? Because what I'm fundamentally describing is a major metacognitive shift as the result of emerging technology that split the way that humans perceive what they thought could only be done. If you went back to 1900 and told Tesla that we would be able to convert machines, we would be able to program machines how to operate, that would have been like using purely electric signals, right? That would have been we can convert kinetic programming actions into electric signals and have them automatically performed by a computer. Are you kidding me? Okay, but now it's just like self-evident. Like, yeah, obviously, like we just talked about software like it's no big deal now. No, this was only 80 years ago, 90 years ago. So it's huge metacognitive shift caused by emerging technology. Now let's fast forward. People still think that the only way to defend a rule set against systemic exploitation and abuse is kinetically. They're making this assumption without even realizing it. You write down a rule on a piece of paper, you call it a constitution, and then you defend against systemic abuse and exploitation of that rule set by shooting each other, right? By applying forces to displace masses. And we just assume, without even realizing it, we make this tacit assumption that the only way to defend a rule set against systemic abuse and exploitation is kinetically. It's through the pulling of levers that we call triggers, right? It's by pressing that button that launches the rocket, okay? And so that's interesting, okay? Because now we can start to compare two totally different metacognitive shifts that could be occurring back to back. Because when software first emerged, if the last 80 years proved anything, it's that a lot of things that we think were only or could only be done through mass-based activities don't actually need to be done through mass-based activities. Like the last 80 years, like the defining characteristic of the last 80 years is like industry after industry being disrupted by software, right? You convert a typewriter into a computer. You convert this into a program. Like everything can be converted into softwares, right? Massless items. And it's just like industry after industry is being disrupted by this. And somehow humans are like routinely surprised by the next thing that can be converted into soft activities. And there's no reason to expect that the profession of warfighting will be any different. That the profession of defending rule sets against systemic exploitation and abuse through the projection of power, through imposing real-world physical costs on that exploitation, right? That profession is just as susceptible to disruption by soft activities, softwares, massless activities, as any other profession.
So looking at current events, I'd say that the soft, non-kinetic sanctions that we try to put on Russia, you know, and the results of those sanctions, like Russia started accepting payment for oil and Bitcoin, and now we're looking at Bitcoin winter. So can you kind of start to talk about how we're seeing the concepts you're describing, non-kinetic effects, being used to assert political power overseas? You know, how does this tie into your thesis?
Bitcoin is based, the key enabling technology, the critical enabling technology behind this assembly of computers and software. So that's an important point to make. Like people use the word cloud and just to like totally ignore the fact that there's like massive infrastructure behind. They just like abstract it away. It's like, oh, it's just a cloud. First of all, it's not really a cloud, right? It's not a collection of water vapor, right? It's actually a huge, you know, array of computers, okay, and software. So it's a combined assembly of hardware and software. Bitcoin's the same way. When we talk about Bitcoin, it's not just software. It's a huge assembly of machines, globally distributed. And it's also a massive amount of brute force physical power, like real power. You can actually measure it in watts. Okay, that's important if you know what the function of power is, or you know how power can be used to defend a rule set.
Sure.
I say all this because the core enabling technology behind Bitcoin is the cost function that Adam Back invented. I had the honor of talking to him for hours, interviewing him as part of my research. Okay, he invented this thing called a cost function. What is a cost function? It's really simple. It imposes a physical cost on any computer or piece of software that tries to solve it. So you create a function whose sole purpose is to be physically prohibitive to solve. That's it. So why would you want to do that? Well, think about what that means. That means software is imposing a real world physical cost on other software. That's interesting, especially if you're a warfighter, especially if you study power projection and the role of power projection. You're talking about software imposing a physical cost on other software through this thing called a cost function, a physical cost function. Hashing can only be solved through brute force. You have to use brute force watts to solve a hash cost function. So that's the key key thing about Adam Back's invention. And why did Adam Back want to create this? It wasn't for money. It was to protect against spam, email spam. What's another name for email spam? Systemic exploitation and abuse. Okay, so the guy wanted to come up with a way to solve systemic exploitation and abuse of a rule set called software by imposing a real-world physical cost on people trying to do that, on people and machines that are unsympathetic to the intent of the rules. So you're starting to see the correlation here. Humans use that power is a great way, the court of power, imposing a real-world physical cost is a great way to force people to be sympathetic to a set of rules or to follow a set of rules. And so what Adam Back was really trying to do with the invention of a hash cost function is to enforce a rule set through brute force physical power by imposing a physical cost on some control action in cyberspace. That's huge. And it didn't take long for other people to realize, boy, you could use this to solve all kinds of systemic abuse and exploitation issues in cyberspace, including maybe, I don't know, a monetary system, because, obviously, like, monetary systems have a tendency to be controlled by a third party, a trusted third party. And so, but before we get there, it's just important to point out that, like, the reason why hash cost functions were invented in the first place was to defend against exploitation and abuse of a rule set. And then people realized that, wait a minute, if you just granted a certificate for solving that cost function, right, and then required that certificate to perform some control action in cyberspace, then what you have literally done, this is not an abstraction, this is not like something that we use to describe the complex emergent behavior of this thing we call software. What you have done is imposed a real world physical cost on something in, from, through cyberspace. And that is huge. That is a big deal for people who understand the role of brute force physical power and its importance of solving systemic abuse of rule sets. So go back to Clausewitz. What is war? War is the blind natural forces of brute force physical power, to include electric watts that have to be exhibited by a computer to solve a cost function. A hash cost function itself is a power competition, a probabilistic power competition that awards clever spirits, right? That's what the hashing industry is. It's a bunch of people engaging in this massive scale power projection competition. So it's already meeting the two criteria of war. What's the third criteria? Is when nations start to use it as an other means for the continuation of policy, to settle policy disputes. So here we go. What if Bitcoin isn't money? Okay. What if Bitcoin is something new? What if society is starting to metacognitively shift the way it perceives warfighting itself, the way it perceives the profession of protecting rule sets against abuse and exploitation using brute force physical power? And the things about warfighting that remain kinetic, that continue to involve forces acting against masses, what if society will start to perceive that as hard war? The things that continue to have mass, the activities that continue to remain kinetic. But the parts of warfighting, the parts of this profession of defending a rule set against exploitation using brute force physical power, by imposing power or by imposing physical costs on things. What if those wares, right, those manufactured items that don't have mass, what if those start to be considered soft war? So if you use physical power to defend rule sets kinetically, it's hardware. If you use physical power electrically to defend rule sets, soft war. Hard war, soft war. Then that means that Bitcoin could be the first global debut of not a monetary system, but a software protocol, a software system, a means for nations to settle policy disputes, the first of which just happens to be an international monetary policy dispute. There's a big difference between Bitcoin as a software protocol and the implications, the national strategic implications of Bitcoin as a software protocol, and Bitcoin as a way for nations, internet money. And that's why our senior leaders need to be paying attention, because what we are really talking about here is a bunch of people instantiating a rule set in cyberspace, cooperating together at a global scale to defend that rule set against exploitation and abuse, using brute force physical power by imposing a real world physical cost on people who would try to attack that rule set or exploit that rule set. And they're succeeding. And nations are adopting it now, not just Russia. There are nations that have it as their fiat, their actual, like, by law, this is our currency. But it won't just be useful as a way to defend or instantiate monetary policy. It'd be useful for a lot of other means too. It just so happens that the first policy dispute it's being used as that other means, as Clausewitz would say, for the continuation policy is just a monetary policy dispute. I'll stop there. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, making great sense. So we're seeing the cost of hash is disconnected somewhat into the price of Bitcoin. So like we have miners in Texas having to shut down operations because of a heat wave that's been going on. I live in San Antonio and experiencing this right now. That it's too expensive to run the mines, versus what you're gaining from Bitcoin. So can you talk to that a little bit? And I am plugging TMG Core as well. We run cooling systems for Bitcoin miners. So it's an immersive cooling that drastically reduces the cost of hash. And so, talk to me about how do those technologies play into what you're describing as a projection of power?
I think that Satoshi's decision to call Bitcoin strictly a monetary system is probably like the biggest undersell in history. And obviously these tokens that we abstract as coins can be used as these abstractions called money if we want it to be. Money can be anything we want it to be, to include abstract coins. But there's so much more value to Bitcoin than just money. The primary value of Bitcoin, in my opinion, is the defense of rule sets. And it just so happens that the main rule set that Bitcoin is being used to defend right now is its own rule set. Right? Like it's a self-enforcing rule set. The mechanism through the thing that people are monetizing, which is watts, that's another misnomer. There's no real coins. What Bitcoin really is a big collection of watts, like real world watts that you can measure. It's a real thing. It's not like a fake thing. Those watts are electric watts, so they don't have a position. So you have to abstract the position of those watts as this thing called coins. But the resource itself is a real world resource. It's not an abstraction. I digress. The point is, Bitcoin is a system that projects power to defend its own rule set against systemic exploitation and abuse. The fundamental and primary value delivered function of this thing called mining is not minting coins. It's to defend the rule set. It's to make it too expensive to exploit the longest chain is valid chain consensus rules. And so that's another thing that we need to understand is that, like, we're talking about, for the first time ever, a cyber defense system that doesn't use just a bunch of more bloatware rules to try to protect itself. Everyone knows what the exploitation of Bitcoin is. Everyone knows 51% attack. They just can't do it. Why? Because it's too physically prohibitive to do it. So Bitcoin is a piece of software that it defends itself not with other software. It defends itself with real world brute force physical power. People are literally imposing watts on attackers. It's too physically expensive to attack Bitcoin. That's why it's not being systemically exploited. And so the function of mining, function of the hashing industry is defense. That's the primary value delivered function, is defense, not minting these abstractions we call coins.
So is the Space Force focused on that defense, and are they looking at high performance computing as a national security asset?
To my knowledge, no one in the Space Force or in the DoD is looking at Bitcoin in any capacity as any power projection protocol or national strategic defense assets whatsoever. That's like my whole deal, is like trying to get people to maybe consider it as something more than just a monetary system, something that will be adopted by nations themselves as another means to project power. Because all you have to do, like if you want to defend a piece of software in cyberspace now, the easy way to do it effectively is to charge a Bitcoin for it. Because if you charge a Bitcoin for something, then you are actually imposing a real world physical cost on that control action. And so it's only a matter of time until other nations learn that they can defend their systems in, from, through cyberspace through what could be the world's debut of a SoftWar protocol. And if that's true, to answer your question that I never answered, then the United States should seriously start to consider stockpiling this medicine, because it could be used, and maybe stop listening to the doctors that say this is a bad form of medicine.
Well, when the Space Force is ready to start getting serious about high performance computing, we're ready to support them. And I hope it doesn't take waiting for you to make general, sir. But thank you so much for everything you're doing, Major Lowery. David, it's good to see you. Thank you for your time, and it was a great discussion.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
Yep, thanks.
Don't go anywhere.
Thank you, Jason. I'm waiting to see how soon he's going to be a general too.
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys would be a force to be reckoned with, right? If we're going to weaponize Bitcoin, we need somebody who can mine it better than anybody. I think you're a match made in heaven.
Certainly, we'll be exchanging emails.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. Fascinating conversation.